The Adani Carmichael coal mine seemingly facing more hurdles at the state government level, and Labor saying it won't review any sort of environmental process if it gets into office, despite more revelations about some concerns about lack of detail from the CSIRO. Joining me now is Lucas Dow, the CEO of Adani Mining here in Australia. Thanks very much for your time. I might just start broadly on this. The state government has made it clear there's still going to be delays on this project, the black-throated finch, also the groundwater plan. This looks, at the earliest, does it not, years away of actually happening?
Good morning, Tom. Well, look, we're obviously working very closely with the Queensland Department of Environment and Science to finalise these plans. There's no practical reason why we shouldn't be able to conclude those in the ensuing weeks. Frustratingly, and I think you already pointed to it, again, another 11th hour so-called additional review has been kicked off by the Queensland Labor government in relation to the groundwater management. So despite having agreed previously that they'd rely upon the advice from CSIRO and Geoscience Australia, it now seems that they're hell-bent on creating another review process that will again involve CSIRO and Geoscience Australia. And frustratingly, they're not providing any clarity or transparency in terms of the questions they put to the CSIRO and Geoscience Australia, nor a timeframe to conclude it. But certainly, we'd expect that this could reasonably wrap up in the next few weeks.
On that information, the groundwater plan approved by the government, there was this caveat by CSIRO which has been revealed this week. This is from the CSIRO. I've been careful about not being categoric about the degree to which these responses will satisfy the recommendations. The devil is in the detail that we do not have. What do you take that to mean?
Well, that's really a question for the Federal Department of Environment and Energy. The reality is, as the proponent, we put forward a management plan that meets the environmental conditions. The Federal Department's then obligated to assess that. They've called on expert advice from Geoscience Australia and also the CSIRO. And then ultimately the CSIRO provided written advice that they were satisfied with the recommendations and the improvements that we'd made to the plan.
Satisfied with the caveat though. So again, that quote, the devil is in the detail that we do not have. That clearly is not a final approval of the entire plan, is it?
Well, I think importantly, the CSIRO and Geoscience Australia, two of the most preeminent science organisations in Australia, and I should be at pains to point out that we've got no issue with their involvement. In fact, we welcomed that and the process in which the Federal Department had engaged. Ultimately, the Federal Department is the decision maker in this process. The input that they've had from Geoscience Australia and CSIRO is just one of a number of elements that I expect they've considered in their decision. So ultimately, it's a question for the Federal Department in terms of what was considered, but ultimately our plan has met the requirements and the conditions, and as you rightly pointed out, both the federal government and also the federal opposition have made it crystal clear they won't be revisiting any of our existing approvals or reviewing any of these approvals.
But when the state says or talks about reviewing the groundwater plan, and it has this quote from the CSIRO that they don't have detail, and that's where the devil is, isn't that fair enough to want to get more detail?
Well, Tom, let's be crystal clear. We've been at this for over 2 years. So the Queensland Department of Environment and Science have had input across the 11 versions that we've submitted. So the fundamental question, and we've never shirked the science, nor having being exposed to review and so forth. The issue we've got is that effectively, despite the Queensland government having said on the 18th of February this year that they wouldn't be undertaking a separate or independent review, they'd rely upon the same advice from the Federal Department that they've received from the CSIRO and Geoscience Australia. Yet here we are, and they're initiating another review. In fact, just last night they wrote to us saying that they had to put in place a contract with Geoscience Australia and CSIRO, and that they refuse to provide the questions that they're putting to those departments. It's clearly a secretive and non-transparent process. And the reality is, right now, this Queensland government is standing in the way of us delivering thousands of jobs for people here in Queensland.
But on the groundwater plan, I mean, this is vital, the artesian source of water in Australia for a lot of farmers. It is here in black and white, is it not? I don't know what I'm misconstruing. Part of the detail is not there. That's what we're hearing from CSIRO.
No, I think, again, that's a question you'd have to put to the Federal Department. We've provided a plan, and our plan addresses all the conditions. I think importantly, there's been a lot of misconception and lies and mythology around our project. The reality is we're not extracting water directly from the Great Artesian Basin. We've got no licences to do that. So this plan doesn't contemplate that aspect. Again, we're not extracting water from the Great Artesian Basin. So to say we are is just a complete and outright lie.
The clarification of part of that is where the water comes from. Look, I do want to get to some other issues within that, though, including in jobs, because this has been a big part of proponents of the mine, how many jobs it will create. Now, the direct jobs, according to the Queensland Land Court, for 1,464. Adani says a lot more indirect. That was with a much bigger project. With the size of it now, how many jobs are we talking about?
So, Tom, during the ramp-up of construction, we'll deliver over 1,500 direct jobs and a further 6,750 indirect jobs. So we're talking about 8,250 jobs that currently don't exist in Queensland. And importantly, those jobs will be delivered in regional Queensland. And some of those areas have got the highest unemployment levels in the state. So we've got people, and there's a groundswell of support, particularly in places like Rockhampton, Mackay, Townsville. In fact, I was in Claremont last night. People are fed up with the Queensland government treating Adani and also people in regional Queensland like mugs. It's time for the Queensland government to get on with it.
Can I just clarify, though? So 1,500 jobs, is that with the previous
direct
mine?
jobs,
because
that's
this
right.
one's about a quarter. This one's a quarter of the size because you had to scale back the project.
So, Tom, we've been through this in terms of the direct jobs across the mine and rail during the ramp-up of construction. And then, as I said, the Queensland Resource Council, their modelling indicates typically for every direct job, there's another 4.5 indirect jobs created. So, again, we'll be delivering in the order of 8,250 jobs into the Queensland economy that currently don't exist.
But was that the figure for the old mine that was 4 times as big?
Well, so, Tom, we've reconfigured the mine significantly. There's a lot of water that's gone under the bridge. What I'm focused on now is delivering this 10 million tonne per annum, the 200 kilometres of rail, and that's precisely the job numbers that it'll create during the ramp-up of construction. 1,500 direct jobs, a further 6,750 indirect jobs during the ramp-up of construction of the mine
because
and rail.
the 1,464 direct, look, I know there's indirect jobs. I don't want to get into the modelling of it. Let's accept that the figure Adani's put out there. But 1,464 direct jobs were when this mine was 4 times as big. So you're saying it's the same number, even though it's a quarter of the size at the moment?
Oh, Tom, there was a lot of work done previously. You know, we've come in, we've reconfigured the mine in order to be able to deliver this for both scale, capital efficiency and also speed. We've been through the numbers. I know we've counted through. We know exactly the contracts. There's 1,500 direct jobs during the ramp-up and construction of this mine.
But has the number changed, the number of jobs changed after the size of the mine?
Well, the configuration's changed. As the configuration... So I think a couple of things. The configuration of the mine site has changed. And what we're talking about is during the ramp-up of construction, the numbers that you're quoting, I'm not sure whether they were steady state or what you're referring to, but essentially what we're talking about, during the ramp-up of construction, we'll create 1,500 direct jobs, further 6,750 indirect jobs.
So just to clarify on that, though, is this a figure much smaller than it was before? Is there a smaller number of jobs? Can you give me a figure on how many? Yeah, go on.
So, Tom, what we've got is we've got a 10 million tonne per annum mine that we've configured with a 200 kilometre rail. So previously we were looking at a standard gauge rail that would have run parallel and effectively been 400 kilometres. So in many instances, it's a very different project. What we've done is we've gone through, methodically worked out what the work packages are, what the relevant scopes are that we require to build and ramp up the operation, and there'll be 1,500 jobs created for the mine and rail construction of our project.
Okay, now Adani obviously is the first of many potential mines in the Galilee Basin. If we see this whole area mined ultimately, would you assume that makes for cheaper coal globally?
Well, I think the important thing, Tom, to recognise is the reality is coal is abundant. The one benefit that we have got in Australia is that we have got some of the highest quality coal in the world. So the reality is if the coal doesn't come from Queensland or Australia or New South Wales, and in particular in our case from the Galilee Basin, the coal will be sourced from other jurisdictions such as Indonesia, US, Russia and so forth, and typically jurisdictions with higher environmental impacts for their coal. So in short, if I was to compare, say, coal out of the Galilee, on a like-for-like basis, you're typically looking at 30% more emissions coming from those other jurisdictions. So the reality is it's environmentally foolish to be able to shut in some of the better quality coal, because the reality is demand in Southeast Asia and countries like India is going to continue to grow over the decades to come.
But this is also, I mean, this is a massive amount of coal. We're talking about 9 mega mines proposed, 247,000, I think, kilometres of thermal coal basin. That is a lot more supply in the market. That has to have an impact, is it not, on coal prices and how much coal is used around the world?
Well, I think the important thing is to think about the markets that we'll be selling into. So essentially we're on Asia's doorstep. We've got a strategic advantage in terms of logistics. So we've got that competitive advantage. Essentially, those volumes coming into the market obviously will be meeting that increasing demand out of Southeast Asia, where we might see other countries such and continents such as Europe start to pull back. So essentially, we'll be producing into what is going to be a growing market. It has been a growing market. And importantly, if Australia's not contributing and delivering into this market, those tonnes are going to come from somewhere else, which is worse for the environment. And it also means that our country's going to miss out on economic opportunities and jobs for Australian and Queenslanders, because essentially they'll be offshore.
But when you look at the life of these mines, I mean, this could be decades into the future. How can you say that, say, in 30 years' time, the coal we would be shipping would have been replaced by other coal instead? We don't know what other countries will be doing by then, do we?
Well, I think the reality is, as I said, coal is abundant. So the benefit we've got is the quality of our coal in terms of both the energy content and also the environmental impacts associated with burning our coal. The reality is that those places like India and other countries in Southeast Asia have just recently installed new coal-fired power stations. They're going to continue to operate those for the next 30 to 40 years. They are going to require coal.
India, for one, says it will end coal imports in the next few years. But look, I guess the broad argument of this always comes down to whether or not just Adani, but the Galilee Basin accessing all of that coal will increase emissions overall around the world. It's impossible for you to say, is it not, that it won't increase emissions at all around the world over the next few decades?
Well, Tom, what I can certainly say is that if we shut in the Galilee Basin, that coal source from other jurisdictions, it will certainly have a greater impact and a detrimental impact in terms of increasing emissions across the globe. We've got the best quality coal here in Queensland and Australia. It's the opportunity for us to be able to mine that responsibly. And I must also add the fact that Australia's governed and regulated in a way that many other countries aren't. So if you were going to mine, this is the place to be able to do it.
So when you say that, though, is there modelling produced on that, say, what will be happening in 10, 20, 30 years?
Well, yeah, so we've seen there's a group, Commodity Insights, who specialise simply in coal forecasting and looking at the market development. The reality is, in 2017, India imported around 137 million tonnes of coal. Of that, Australia contributed just 3 million tonnes. What that means is that other 134 million tonnes, the balance, has come from other jurisdictions and typically poorer quality coals. Our opportunity is to be able to compete in there, displace those poorer quality coals, get a better environmental outcome, and see that economic benefit flow to Queenslanders and Australians in the way of royalties, jobs, taxes, employment and investment.
Lucas Dow from Adani, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Tom.